some very helpful people around us here today, so they should be able to help. So today, what I would like to use, what I like to do to use the time is to share with you a psychotherapy approach called motivational interviewing. I understand most of you here should be undergraduate students studying psychology or counseling. Some of you therefore might have heard about different psychotherapy approaches. You may even have heard about motivational interviewing. But there should be also some of you who is not so familiar with this approach. In the talk today, I will talk about some of the basics of motivational interviewing, some of the background information, what is motivational interviewing, why do we need it in psychotherapy, the spirits and the processes of motivational interviewing. But it is important for you to take note that this short lecture today is not a clinical training on motivational interviewing. So you will not be able to know how to use motivational interviewing. We will not have adequate information, knowledge to try some of the techniques or skills in motivational interviewing. But hopefully what I'll be able to do by sharing some of the basic information with you is that you have enough knowledge, enough understanding to make a decision on whether this is something you would like to pursue in the future. Either get some formal clinical training on this, or even just read about this motivational interviewing yourself in more details. Most of what I will talk about today come from this very important text, the Motivational Interviewing Textbook, 3rd edition, written by the original developer. It's important if you do decide to read more into it and get this textbook for you to get the 3rd edition of this book, because it has some important changes from its 1st and 2nd edition. So to start off with, I would like to ask some questions. These questions you do not have to answer me, but try to think about this question yourself in your head and answer them in your own mind. First of all, do you help when others have emotional difficulty? This need not be a formal psychotherapy context. It can be simply helping out with your friend who is feeling sad, who is feeling anxious, or perhaps even feeling a bit angry about something. Do you have experience in helping your friends out in these situations? I guess most of you do have encountered such situation, and especially if you're interested in psychology, studying psychology, you'll be interested in people's feelings and trying to help them out, especially if these are the people who are important in your life. So what would be some of the recent or previous important situations that you have helped others emotionally? And when you were doing that, when you were trying to help people out, how do you feel when you succeed in helping them feel better? So perhaps a friend comes to you and had a long chat about some of the recent difficulty that your friend had. After the talk, after the chat, the friend tells you that he or she is feeling much better after talking to you. At that moment, how would you feel? How will you feel when your effort in helping this friend paid off? I guess naturally, most of us would feel satisfied, feeling our effort has been useful in some way. You know, we and the friend that you had been helping would be feeling positive at that time, at this moment. But have you encountered this other situation where you keep helping a friend with a difficulty? You keep giving this friend advice, suggestions, on how to make them feel better or improve their life. But then this help is not bringing any change for this person, for this friend. This friend keeps coming to you every week, demanding your time and attention and complaining about this difficulty that he or she is facing. And every time, every week, you put all your effort and mental energy into listening to this friend, listening about this difficulty and offering advice. But then it seems that the problem is getting nowhere. Your help is not translating into any benefits for this person. How would you feel and what would you do in such a situation? It is this third question, under this context, that motivational interviewing emerged. So let's start off with a definition of psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is an interpersonal process designed to bring about modifications of feelings, cognitions, attitudes, and behaviors which have proved troublesome to a person. One key word here is modification here. It is about change, making change in how someone is feeling, how someone is thinking, and how someone is behaving. And of course, we need to change these feelings and thinking and behavior would be because these things have been proving troublesome for a person, problematic for a person. In the context of psychotherapy, these changes that we need to help people make usually can be difficult changes, because if they are easy changes, the person would have probably dealt with it already in their own time, or perhaps speaking with a friend or trying to do something relaxing, then they will be feeling better, then they're okay, and to go on with their life. But if that person has to make an effort to go to see a psychotherapist, using a dedicated time to talk with a stranger, someone who did not know in his life, and talk to this person about all the life difficulties that she is facing, then this change probably is something that's not so easy to make. One of the very difficult changes that we help people deal with in the clinic is when people have present with addictive behaviors. For example, alcoholism. Some people have the problem of binge drinking. They drink lots of alcohol, perhaps on a daily basis. And the amount of alcohol that they consume can even have a impact on how and in what they do in their usual life. For example, it affects their work, it affects their study, it affects even their relationships, because perhaps people in his life is offended by his alcoholism. When people drink a lot of alcohol, they tend to do foolish things and say foolish things, and it could offend people easily. So drinking alcohol itself may not be a problem, but when it becomes a problem of binge drinking and alcoholism, then change is needed. But then helping these people with addictive behaviors to change is not so easy. Even when through the course of psychotherapy, we see this person, we counsel them, we give them advice on how to stop or cut down on using alcohol. Sometimes they can get better, they become recovered in some way. Either they completely stop using the alcohol, they abstain from the alcohol, or cut down substantially, such that the alcohol is no longer affecting their life. But then they could often experience relapses. That means they get back into that mode of binge drinking. So they get better and then they get worse, they get better and they get worse. And this is a common theme in helping people change. In fact, difficulty in making change can be a common experience. It doesn't need to happen just in a psychotherapy clinic. It could happen to you and I. What would be some of the difficulties that you have encountered in your life? The changes that you had difficulty in making could be something behavioral. For example, stopping yourself from playing a very addictive video game. You spend a lot of time on that game. You don't go out. You don't meet people, even though your friends has been inviting you to go out and see a movie, but you prefer to stay at home playing this video game. The change could also be relational. For example, leaving a toxic relationship. For example, perhaps you're in a romantic relationship, but then you don't feel the relationship is not going anywhere. And you want to leave the relationship, but somehow you're not feeling so sure. You don't know how to leave the relationship. This leaving relationship is also a change. The change could also be something that's more abstract. Could be something such as making an emotional decision on whether to decide to forgive someone who has previously offended you on a previous occasion. So it needs not be about changing something behavioral. It can be something that's emotional, something about relationships. Now, as a psychotherapist, and what I would like to invite you to do is try to imagine yourself being a professional therapist for a moment. First of all, you will have to identify what would be the change that you need to help your client make through the course of psychotherapy. Is it about the addictive alcoholism, addictive video gaming? Is it about leaving a relationship? Or is it about something emotional? First of all, you have to identify what exactly is the problem. But then you would also, being a sensitive therapist, need to be aware of how ready this person is about making this change. In the Transtheoretical model of change, it differentiates that people can be at different states, different readiness of change. For example, in the action stage, this is the stage of people making the real change, doing something about it. For example, someone who has alcoholism has decided and is trashing all the alcohol stock in his home. So this is actual concrete action of getting rid of all the alcohol he has in his home, because he knows that he needs to get rid of the alcohol in order to improve, in order to make the change. At this stage of readiness, the change is active. But then before this stage, people has to prepare for making this change. They need to plan, they need to think, oh, what I need to do in order to make this change. And this would be a common stage in psychotherapy where the therapist help the clients to prepare for the actions needed to make the change. But even after having made the action of making the change, we also need to pay attention on how the client is maintaining the change. Because as I mentioned earlier, it can be easy, it can be common for people to get back to their old problem. Even though the person has trashed all the alcohol in his home, he could easily go to the supermarket and buy a whole new stock of alcohol home and get back into the alcoholic cycle. Or even for other changes, for example, if that person has taken action to leave a toxic relationship, what he or she would need to do is to maintain staying away from the relationship, because otherwise they could relapse, they could get back into the toxic relationship. But before all these stages, before preparing for action, it would be the stage of contemplation, thinking whether I really need to make the change, whether I really need to cut down on alcohol, whether I really need to leave the relationship. In this state, the client would be thinking a lot of different considerations, whether it is important, whether it is he needed to make that change, because making the change would take effort. It would take a lot of mental energy and would mean a lot of changes in his life. Perhaps it would mean that something he enjoyed, he can no longer enjoy. So this would be a stage of a lot of thinking going on, not a lot of action. But even before this state of contemplation would be the state of pre-contemplation. That means the person is not even thinking, is not even considering that he needs to change. We also will see people in the pre-contemplation stage in the clinic. Usually it is not because they wanted to be here, because they are not even considering needing to change, needing to improve. But then perhaps it's because they are mandated, or they were requested by other people to come to the psychotherapy clinic. For example, if somebody with alcoholism, if we continue to use this example, he may not think that he needs to change. He may not think that the alcohol is affecting his work. He somehow feel that he's still managing his life as usual. But then his wife, his family is seeing a clear difference in how he behaves. And so this family is dragging him to a psychotherapy clinic because these people want him to change. But it doesn't mean that he wants to change himself. So regardless of what the problem is, we also need to have an awareness of how ready this client is about making a change in his life. What will happen though? What will happen if we see a client in the pre-contemplation state, or even in the contemplation state? These clients, perhaps they come to the clinic regularly. A lot of chats about, a lot of conversations about needing to change, but then no action. This could happen even if outside the context of psychotherapy. It can happen, it can occur in daily life when we talk to our friends, when we talk to our family. Somebody keep complaining about certain things. They want to change, they want to improve about something. For example, if a family member keeps complaining about the house being dirty, he really needs to do some housework, proper housework to deep clean the house. But then it's always about talking. It's not about doing anything, making the change, cleaning. Then how will you feel when you talk to these people, when you're stuck in this situation? In this situation, as the helper, as a therapist, you may keep encouraging this person to take some action, give them a lot of suggestions, advice, but then again, there's still no action because perhaps they're in this preparation state, contemplation state, or even pre-contemplation state. How would you feel as the person who is giving advice, as the therapist? In these situations, sometimes in therapy, it can be easy for us to label these clients as resistant. They're resistant to advice, they are resistant to change. All they do is talk, and they do nothing about making the change. But then, of course, we as the helper continue to see this person and try to help them, because this is our job, right? The psychotherapy is about making change, making modification. But some of the natural reaction could be desperation. So desperate that this client is in making some meaningful change, taking the action, the therapist might work extra hard to convince or persuade the client to make change. That means keep giving them reason, keep persuading them, keep giving them enough reason to take the action. So it becomes a situation where the therapist may end up speaking a lot, talking a lot, hoping to finally make some sense into the client. Or alternatively, the therapist could feel frustrated, thinking that the client is always about talk and not doing anything about it. You only know how to complain. In such a situation, if the therapist is feeling very frustrated, the therapist may even confront the clients angrily. This could be sometimes a dramatic presentation of what psychotherapy is like in movies, in other situations where the therapist is really at a loss of what to do because they've been working extra hard to convince the client, but then they're not making any meaningful change in the client. So they try to use the hard way, confronting the client. But then usually when the therapists work very hard to persuade or to confront, it doesn't make things better. So what should we do? That's why motivational interviewing, or MI, becomes helpful. Because in MI, the difficulty in making a change is not seen as a form of client resistance. Rather, it views the situation as a form of ambivalence. What this means here, ambivalence, is that the person, the client, both wants and not wants to make the change simultaneously. They have both the reason of making change and the reason and the motivation of not making the change, of remaining as they are, remaining status quo. In the conversation, this will manifest as yes, but conversations. Yes, I need to change, I need to get away from the relationship, but there's lots of buts, lots of reasons for not leaving the relationship or not cutting down on the alcohol. Yes, I know that the alcohol is making my wife mad, but then, it's just her problem. No one else sees it as a problem. It's just the wife being too sensitive. A lot of their own arguments about not making the change. But then it doesn't mean that they do not have reason to change. Even though the clients may have a lot of reasons, remaining status quo, not making the change, it's often the case that they have reasons. They understand that they need to change because other people has been telling them the reasons that they need to change. So they would have heard a lot of reasons to change. And also deep down, they would understand that the problem is getting in the way of something important for them. So it is not all or nothing that the client is resisting the change, not wanting to change, but then it's maybe somewhere in the middle in terms of wanting to change, in the middle of, just feeling ambivalent, not so sure whether I should make the change. In psychotherapy, there can be different styles of helping people. One style would be the directing style, where the therapist directly tells the client what to do. So you should leave the relationship, you should cut down on the alcohol, you should trash all the alcohol in your home, you should go out to see your friends more and not stay at home playing the video game all the time. This would be advice giving, a lot of directions in how the client should do or should think or should feel. Another way of helping people would be the following style, where the therapist simply listen to whatever the client is saying. So essentially, the therapist can be simply a good listener, because perhaps the stance is he understands that whatever advice, whatever suggestions that he gives, perhaps the client will have the best answer to his own problems. Everybody has their own different style of helping people. So you can think about yourself, when a friend comes to you for help, are you more of the directing type or the following type? But there's also the guiding style in between these two styles of helping, where the therapist is both a good listener and offer expertise where needed. And it is under this middle ground that motivational interviewing was developed as a collaborative conversation style for strengthening a person's own motivation and commitment for change. So it is about strengthening that person, the client's own motivation, rather than the therapist given the client's motivation. In MI, the structure of MI is that it involves 4 interviewing spirits as an underpinning for going through 4 interviewing processes. And we do so facilitated by 4 interviewing CEUs. Today, we do not have a lot of time to go through all of these things here, but what I would like to do is to focus on the first 2, the 4 interviewing spirits and the 4 interviewing processes, so you can get a basic idea of what MI is. For the interviewing skills, we will briefly mention, but then we will not have a lot of time to go through them in details. So we'll start off with the interviewing spirits. The spirits of MI are the therapist's guiding principles. We should be trying to embody all these spirits in whatever we say to our client. First of all, the spirit of partnership. It is about the humble attitude that the therapist should take. Not the stance that I know better, I know the answer to your problem, I know how you should be making the change. But it is a humble attitude of working together. Okay, you and I trying to find the answer together. In this spirit, the therapist would try to avoid falling into the so-called expert trap, where he assumes that he has all the right answers for the client's difficulties. A good way to put it is that the therapist should not be doing MI to or on a client, but doing motivational interviewing with the client. It is especially important to see the client as a partner, especially in the case when they are not feeling so certain whether they should change, or they find it very difficult to change. The top-down authoritarian stance that the therapists take usually would just backfire. Okay? The client will feel not being fully understood by the therapist, and they think that the therapist is not really in tune with their difficulties. So here, the spirit of partnership is very important, of walking through this journey together in making the change with the client. So this will be the spirit of partnership. The spirit of acceptance is a little bit more complicated because there are different factors within this spirit. So if we first of all look at the factor of absolute worth, what this means here is being non-judgmental to the client. We accept that the client is a worthy individual. In traditional Carl Rogers terminology, this would be called the unconditional positive regard for the client. Even though the client is always complaining, not making the change that you want him to change, you want her to change, or even the client says he wants to change, but not taking any action. But then it's important to remind ourselves to be non-judgmental, non-critical of the client, taking this neutral stance in seeing the person, the problem. For autonomy, we accept that the client has the self-direction, the capacity for self-direction, making their own decision in what they do in order to live their life. This is, for me, a very important thing to remind ourselves when helping people, because it kind of relieves our burden that we have to make the client change. Because it's not so possible. We cannot make people change, because people make themselves change. Clients make themselves change. We have to elicit their own change. We have to help the change, but we cannot impose the change. And this is something very important to remember, especially when seeing patients or clients who is very strong-willed. They like to make their own decisions. But then if other people, including a therapist, start to give them a lot of guidance, directions on this is what you need to do, this is what you should do, then again, it may backfire, because the clients may feel that they're not making their own decisions. In accurate empathy, we try to see the clients through their own eyes. This is the opposite of imposing our own perspective. This is the opposite of telling the client, this is how you should see this situation. It's really understanding the difficulty, understanding the client's feelings by stepping into their shoes, really feeling, really understanding their world, the perspective. But then again, empathy, accurate empathy, is not about sympathy. It's not about feeling bad for the client, saying things that, oh, this is such a poor situation. It's also not about identifying. It's not about saying to the client that, oh, I know this feeling, I've experienced something like this before. Because then the attention is not really about the client's own experience. It will be shifted to the therapist's experience. So we need to stay attuned in the client's own experience all the time. For affirmation, we accept that clients, despite all the problems, have their own strengths and efforts. It is the opposite of finding out what is wrong, because in psychotherapy, it can be easy to focus on what's going on, what's going wrong, what needs to change, what's bad. But then it is also important, very important, to try to look at what the client is good at, or what efforts he or she has already made in order to make the needed change. So these spirits of acceptance, we need to, again, try to embody them, embody all these absolute worth, autonomy, accurate empathy, and affirmation in whatever we say, in whatever we do with the client. Moving on to the third spirit of MI, compassion. This is a relatively new addition to the spirits of MI, because in previous previous editions of MI, this was not yet included. But then it reminds us that MI should not be used for our own self-interest, meaning we use the skills of MI to make people change in a way that serves us. Because MI is about helping other people change, helping the client change. It's not about making the change that benefits us, but making the change that benefits the client. Compassion is about actively promoting the client's own welfare, not wanting to see people suffer. Okay, because as I was saying, making change is a very common part of life. Even if you work as a salesperson, your motivation would be making a change in the decision from not buying the item to buying the item. One perhaps could even use the skills of MI to help facilitate this change. But then this would not be real MI because it's not really a compassionate act. It's not really hoping the clients to benefit, but for our own benefits of benefiting from these sales. So whatever we say, whatever we do, the client has to be very compassionate. Finally, the fourth spirit of MI would be evocation. This is the relatively distinctive feature of MI, different from other forms of psychotherapy. It is about not installing what is missing in the client, but eliciting from the client what they already have. For example, the motivation to change, even though the client may not be doing anything, is not making any action, taking any action to change, because perhaps you see that the motivation is not yet fully there. What we do is not install the motivation, but to elicit motivation from the client. We assume that the motivation is already there, but it needs to be strengthened. It needs to be elicited from the client. So these spirits of MI really reflect this approach of psychotherapy as a strength-based approach. It's not a deficit-based approach where we assume the client has some kind of deficit, is missing something, and then we install what's missing. But it's about calling forth. It's about finding it's about finding what's already missing and then getting it out in the open. So, with these four spirits of MI, this again is the guiding principle of the therapist. But what do we actually do? What actually goes on in the therapy? That takes us to the four processes of MI. First of all, we start off with engagement. Engaging with the client. This is a process of establishing a mutually trusting and respectful helping relationship. This is an important factor in psychotherapy, regardless of what kind of psychotherapy you do. Either it's motivational interviewing or other kinds of psychotherapy, because we know from a lot of very solid research that the quality of therapeutic alliance has a direct impact on the therapy outcome. But in MI, the process of engagement is especially important, and it is achieved by primarily two ways. First of all, it's about the reflective listening. It's about reflecting what the client is saying, is talking about the problem, rather than asking them a lot of questions. Because if you try to imagine in a typical situation where a person comes to you for help, what you would naturally want to do is to understand more about the problem. You ask them questions. You try to get a better understanding of the distress. But then it can get into the situations of a lot of questions and a lot of answers. Question, answer, question, answer. This back and forth between you and the person seeking help. It's like ping pong, asking question and then the client gets back to you with an answer, and then you ask more questions. But then in motivational interviewing, it stresses that perhaps we need not ask so many questions, but we can try to reflect a lot more instead of asking questions. By reflections, what we mean here is making a guess on what the client really means. In a lot of communication, not only in the therapy communication, but everyday communication, people don't tend to say directly what they mean. Perhaps they have reason to hide. They don't want to be totally honest in what they say. But it is also the case that people are not really communicative in what they mean. They may find it difficult to articulate. They may find it difficult to put into words to communicate with other people how they are really feeling, or how to make other people understand the internal struggle that they have. The role of the therapist here would be to help to enrich this experience into words, making a guess on what the client really means when they are complaining about a certain problem and when they are talking about a certain struggle that they had. It is kind of a way of, by making reflection instead of questioning, that the therapist is guiding the client to really fully articulate the problem. And interestingly, when we do that, instead of asking a lot of questions, the therapist already can get a lot of information through this process. So getting the information about the problems does not need to be through the questions approach. It could be through the reflections approach. Because gradually, when you make reflections, the clients is really, they keep talking about the problem. Okay, even it can be even quicker to understand the real issue, the real problems, instead of just asking questions. So the second way of engaging with a person is to explore their values and their goals. This is about moving beyond the problem, moving beyond the problem that needs solving, the distressing problem. But understanding the client as a person, what's important for him, what is his goal in life, and how is this problem, this presenting problem, is interfering with his own value and goal. If through the course of during the course of conversation, we get to that point of really understanding the client's values and goals, and understanding how the problem is really interfering with what they want to do in life, then the client would naturally feel understood, and he will feel that he has a good connection with you as the therapist. Hence, the therapeutic alliance would get stronger and stronger. So this is the first process of motivational interviewing. It's about establishing, really understanding the client's problems, the values, but not by questioning, but by reflecting what they mean. The second process would be focusing. It's about finding a mutually agreeable direction in therapy, because it is possible for a therapist to be well engaged with a person. They can talk about a lot of stuff, a lot of the problems. The flow of the conversation is good. He feels a good relationship with the therapist. But then the conversation is getting nowhere. There's no clear direction of what to talk about in therapy. So it's not just about chit-chatting. It's not about having a good conversation, but we also have to have a clear direction of where the conversation is going. It's about a talk. Let's talk about what to talk about in therapy. Okay, now that we've understood the problem, we've understood how the problem has been interfering with your life, let's talk about the way ahead. What should we do in therapy to help make you better? So this is an important process of finding a mutual goal in therapy. Moving on to the third process in MI, evoking. This is the stage of strengthening the motivation to change by resolving ambivalence. The therapist here in this process of therapy would be to help to change the ratio of change talk and sustained talk. And we need to get into a little bit more details here in terms of what we mean by change talk and sustained talk. In motivational interviewing, change talk refers to the client's self-expressed language that is an argument for change. Whereas sustained talk is about what the clients say, what the clients talk about. That's an argument for the status quo. So some example here is that if the client is saying things like, the relationship is really causing me problem, this would be a form of change talk because the client is talking about a problem. And really, if we try to reflect this statement here, the therapist could say something like, you really want to change from this situation, or the relationship is giving you a lot of headache. It's about this language here expressed by the client is in the direction of making a change in the problem. But then when a client talks about a problem, it can be also the direction of not making a change. For example, the client could say something like, oh, leaving the relationship is so troublesome. I've been thinking about it for so long. I've been talking to other people about it, but then it's just simply thinking about it is, I don't want to think about it. It's troublesome, it causes me headache. This language, even though the client is still talking about the problem that needs changing, but then it's spoken in a way that he prefers, is more in the way of just staying at the status quo, not changing. In MI, studies have shown that if the client primarily talks about the problem in the way of sustained talk, or even an equal mix of sustained talk and change talk, it is really associated with the maintenance of status quo. It's not about making, taking the actual action of changing. But then if the client, what they say about the problem has a lot more change talk rather than sustained talk, then that would predict that they are going to take actual action into changing from their situation, changing from the problem. What the therapist has to do, the therapist's role here, is to influence how the client talks about the problem. The therapist, again, is not about asking questions, but it's about enriching, about encouraging the client to speak more, to talk more about the problem in terms of the change talk. Why they want to change, whether they're able to change, the reason, and what they plan to do about the change. The client, the therapist's role would be to recognize the client's change talk, to strengthen it, and to encourage it. The same goes for when the client talks about the downside of the status quo. When they talk, for example, things like, oh, if I don't change, if I still have this alcohol problem, then it's going to continue to affect my relationship with my wife, perhaps even the divorce is in the way. When client talks about this problem with not changing, again, the therapist's role would be to strengthen it, to make them talk, to influence the talk, to make them talk more about this problem with not changing. So it's not about giving advice, it's not about giving suggestions, this is what you should do, but it's about making the client be a bit more aware of the need to change. The way that in motivation interviewing, we try, the way that we do that, the way that we influence the talk is by through these 4 skills here. Asking a lot of open questions instead of closed-ended questions. Because in closed-ended questions, then we are not really enriching the client to talk more. The client could just reply simply yes or no answers. But then by asking open-ended questions, then we are encouraging them to talk more about the problem. We affirm what they say, especially if they are expressing change talk. We affirm that it is a good thing that you are thinking about changing, you're thinking about cutting down on alcohol. We make a lot of reflections. Again, we've spoken a lot about this already. Instead of asking a lot of questions, we also focus on making a lot of reflections in the conversation. Also, the therapist has to make summary of what the client says, because during the course of conversation, a lot of stuff gets spoken. It can even be the case the client would forget what he has spoken a few minutes ago. So the therapist has to have a very good memory, recalling what the client has been saying. And because what we try to do is to strengthen the change talk. So we don't allow the change talk to just get mentioned once. We remind the client on all the reasons and the need to make the change. Finally, in the 4th and final process of motivation interviewing, it's about planning and implementation of making the change. It's about working out what to do, what actions to take. There can be different planning scenarios. For example, the change plan is already clear. The client understands fully what he needs to do, what actions he needs to take in order to make the change. But then obviously the change has not been made, the action has not been taken previously, because perhaps the motivation was not that strong enough to take the action. And that's why we needed the previous processes in MI to strengthen the motivation. Another planning scenario would be that there are different options for making the change. There's plan A, plan B, and plan C, and the client is not sure which plan to use in order to make the change. Alternatively, the way to change is totally unclear. The client has no idea on how to make the change, even though he or she is already motivated to make the change, because the previous 3 processes has been, facilitated, and the motivation is strong. But then it can even still be the case that someone is motivated to change, but at a loss of not knowing what to do in order to change. In these situations where the therapist help the client to plan for change, again, we need to we need to recall the four spirits of MI. We need to work through the plan like a partner with the client. We need to be accepting in the difficulty in the clients for making the change. We need to give them the autonomy to make the decision on what plan to take, etc. So in MI, the process of therapy is like a therapeutic journey. We begin from the bottom. This schematic here is like a staircase. So we start from the bottom with engagement, engaging a client, building up the therapeutic relationship. And this stage here serves as the foundation of all the other processes of therapy. In engagement, if we take the metaphor of going on a journey, is asking the client, shall we travel together? Shall we go somewhere together? Shall we travel to make the change? In focusing, it's about asking the client, where to? Where do you want to go in your life? What change would you like to make? In the process of evoking, it's about asking them whether and why to travel there. What is the reason of going there? What's your motivation? Why do you need to go there? Okay, because making the trip, going there takes effort, and we need to have motivation to go there. So this is the process, the stage of strengthening that motivation to make the efforts to go there. And finally, for the planning stage, is about how and when to travel. How do we get there, and what do we do in order to get there? So to conclude, motivational interviewing is about helping people to make a change when the change is difficult. The difficulty in making the change could be because there's both reason for making the change and reasons for not making the change. Because very often it's the case that making a change has both costs and benefits. And when people are caught in this middle ground of being ambivalent about making the change, then it's very hard to see them take real action in making the change. Even though in the role of a helper, in the role of a therapist, we would be eager to see the clients to make change, because this would be our job, this would be our motivation as the therapist, to see that people benefit from our help. Motivational interviewing was developed to address this problem. It is a person-centered counseling style. It's not really a set of skills, not a set of techniques, but it is a style of seeing a client. And then its focus is to help people overcome their ambivalence to change, to strengthen the motivation. There are, of course, situations where clients is already motivated, very motivated to change. All he wants, perhaps, is some good advice, suggestions on what to do in order to make the change. In such situation, in such case, the therapist, of course, can give suggestions in a very direct way, because the client is really eager to receive the suggestions. But then MI is about helping those people who are not yet so sure, not yet so motivated. They're still deciding whether to make the change. And this is a common situation in therapy. The good thing about MI is that it is very well defined, described and quantified. We can do a lot of research studies on it. There are a lot of research studies already published for showing its effectiveness in helping people with mental health problems. It makes MI makes very complicated and abstract ideas in therapy into quite digestible and understandable ideas, so that people, therapists, learning and receiving training on how to do psychotherapy can really benefit in understanding how, as a therapist, we should help a client, what stance we should take, what is the attitude, and what is the style when helping a person. So that's it for what I've prepared for you today. Hopefully, it hasn't been too much for you to digest. I know in a very short time, I had to give you a basic idea on this whole psychotherapy approach. Is not very easy to understand fully what MI is, but hopefully I've shared with you adequate information and ideas for you to have a very basic and brief idea. For the remaining time, about 15 minutes, I would be available to answer some of the questions that you have. But again, I'm not so familiar with how this works. So let me try to do this. I should try to open the chat box, right? And I see some of you already have questions here posted. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to type now in the chat box. We do have a bit of time for us to discuss together on this topic. One question I see, I'm going to read this aloud. It is a challenge to make guess for probing out the client's thought. What is your advice to make a better guess? It's a very good question, because in MI, the focus is on making reflections, making a guess on what the client is saying, instead of asking them questions and about the problem. So what we do, what we try to do is we have to get back to the spirits, one of the spirits of MI. We talked about accurate empathy, trying to really imagine yourself in the client's world, and then to go from there. Also, it is important for us not to worry about making a wrong guess, because it is inevitable that we will make wrong guess. But then if we, when we make the reflection, if we maintain that humble attitude, that spirit of partnership, then even when we have made the wrong guess, wrong reflection of what the client meant, the client would not be offended. And that would be something to avoid. We do not want to have the client feel offended in what we say. Mm-hmm. But if we make the reflection in a very authoritarian attitude, in the style that, oh, I know this is how you must be feeling, this is what you're thinking, or this is what your underlying worry. If we say that in a very sure way, if we say that in a very imposing way, then the client would get offended and the therapeutic alliance would be affected. So it is about the empathy, about using, stepping into the client's perspective, building on what they say in the reflection, and just be open that your reflection may not be accurate. Because when we are being open about it, then the client will just correct us. He will continue to provide the information, talk about the problem in a way that makes us easier to understand. So this is how I would approach the situation when I have difficulty or in being very sure about what the client means. Because again, especially it's the first time or second time of meeting a client, we do not yet fully understand them as a person. We are bound to make wrong guesses. Okay, so moving on with other questions. I would like to ask whether eventually MI allows not to change. Well, again, this is a very good question because we've been talking about being very open for the clients to make their own decision. We give them the autonomy to decide whether they change or not to change. So to be straightforward in answering this question, I guess yes. In MI, we do not impose people to change. Therefore, we can say that we allow them to decide not to change. What we do here in this situation where we can see the problem. We can see the problem is really affecting the client. But ultimately, the client decided not to change. They must have their own reason of not changing. What we can try to do is to understand fully what their considerations are. What are the reasons of not changing? What are the reasons of them not making the decision to change? And if they have good reason, and if that reason is something that's considered, they've considered it carefully, then why not? Why not that we continue to let the clients make their own decision on whether to change? Of course, one other thing that we can do is to find some discrepancy in that decision. What I mean is that if the client has decided not to change, that means the problem will persist. The issue, the starting problem would persist. For example, the alcoholism will persist, or he will be continuing with the toxic relationship. But would that problem interfere with what they value? Would that interfere with the personal goals? Now, their values and personal goals are what we would try to find out in the engagement process, if you remember. If the problem does not really interfere with the goal and the value, then it's really not much of a problem. So yes, we do allow them not to change for most instances. So I hope that I've addressed this question. Next question. Can you share your own experience, how you utilize MI to a patient? Well, this is a difficult question to answer, to address in a very short time, because today time is limited and it's not easy to use just a few minutes to share to you all what I do every day in my work. But just to share some personal experience with you on using MI, I think it's important for me as a therapist to recall to the spirits of MI whenever I face a challenging clinical situation. Especially because when my role is to help people, naturally, I would want them to change. I would want them to improve. I would want their life to be better. But then if I have this clinical situation that the client is not really receiving what I say well, he's not following my suggestions, then I guess I would take a step back and do a lot more of this motivational interviewing work with this person, trying to find out the reason of the client not making the change, and perhaps to try to strengthen the motivation. in order to really strengthen that motivation to take action. The opposite would be to give them a lot of advice, suggestions on problem solving. But then if the client is not fully ready to problem solve, then no matter how many good solutions that we have, the client will not use any of the solutions because he or she is not yet motivated to solve the problem. So the next question is, I met clients with depression and they lacked energy to change. It's really hard to find change talk on the conversation. Yeah, what do we do in this situation when there's very little change talk? All they do is to talk about the problems and not wanting to change, or it's very difficult to change. This can be especially the case when people have depression because they are affected by this pervasive low mood. They don't have this energy to move on with life. What do we do in such situation? My own experience is that I would try to spend more effort into understanding their values and their goals. What do they want to do in life? What do they like to do in the future? What's important for them? Perhaps some people find that the family is important for them. And depression is really worrying for their family. In such a case, we can try to build some discrepancy that I mentioned in just earlier. On the one hand, it's very difficult to make the change because you're feeling so depressed, you're feeling so low, you don't feel like going out, you don't feel like seeing people, you don't feel like doing anything at all, you just want to stay in bed. But then at the same time, you staying in bed all the time is a big worry for your family. And I know from what you said earlier, your parents, your family is very important for you. So by really understanding beyond the presenting problem, understanding not just the depression, but understanding the client as a whole, what's important for them deep in their heart, can help us move the process forward. And this is what I would suggest we can try to do at such a situation. Next question. What intervention would you give to a client if they start to make change, if they start to take action and then relapse, if they get back into the problem? What do we do? First of all, we need to think about renewing the motivation. Renewing the motivation to change. We need to understand, we need to listen more. We need to hear out what was the problem, what was the reason for the relapse, and then we move on from there. Okay. I would suggest in such a case, such a situation, do not be too quick into offering suggestion. Do not be too quick to say that, oh, you need to stop this immediately. You need to stop the drinking, you're relapsing into alcoholism. Because that would be advice giving. That would be a direct instruction that the clients should do this and that. But to take a softer stance in order to understand a bit more what just happened, what occurred, in order to make you fall into that relapse. So this is what I would suggest. I'm interested in what kinds of clients would benefit from MI, and from your client experience, how MI's effectiveness compared with other psychotherapy, such as CBT. Speaking from personally, I would say that MI can benefit all clients, especially if we think about the spirits of MI, the spirits of partnership, acceptance, the spirits of evocation and compassion. I think these four spirits of MI is applicable in whatever clients that we see. Whenever we help to make people change, making difficult decisions, taking difficult action to change, we do need these spirits to facilitate the clients making change. In terms of the processes of MI, especially the process of evocation, because evocation, if you remember, is a relatively unique aspect of MI. It's about evoking the change talk. I would say that would be especially important for people who is not yet so motivated, not yet decided whether they should make the change. And how is the MI's effectiveness compared with psychotherapy, such as CBT? There are, in fact, research studies that look directly into this question, comparing MI with different therapy modalities. In research, MI sometimes is referred to as motivational enhancement therapy. You can go, if you're interested, to look into all the different details of the research data. But speaking from a practical perspective, I think it is not so practical or useful to think about comparisons. Because in therapy, what actually happens is a very fluid process. We need to use the different ideas, different skills of different modalities of therapy. In my own clinical practice, I do a lot of motivational interviewing, but I also do a lot of CBT, and they go hand in hand together in my own understanding. They are not really contradictory. It's not the case that I do MI for one session and then CBT for the next session, but what I try to do is try to embody the spirits of MI and then use the skills of CBT or perhaps other therapies. So it would be important to learn about other therapies as well, even though today our focus is on motivational interviewing. So next question. I want to know if MI also applies on clients with intellectual disabilities. Does IQ matter for MI? Well, this question, I think, is does not apply specifically for MI, but psychotherapy in general. For clients with intellectual disabilities, meaning individuals with low IQ, so does it really work? Is it applicable? MI? Again, what I will suggest, the way we think about this question is go back to the spirits of MI. I think it is applicable because we still need to be very compassionate to these people. We want them not to suffer. We want them to live a good life. We also accept that they can make their own decisions because we, as a therapist, cannot make them change. In order for them to change, they have to change themselves. We need to be very accepting. We need to also evoke from themselves their own wish to change, their own need to change. Even though they're not the smartest people, they're not the most intelligent people, it doesn't mean that they don't have their own thinking. Mm-hmm. So yes, for me, I think it also applies. May I know more about the differentiation between MI and Transtheoretical model of change? as both models are close, and I found that TTM will be used in MI sometimes. So MI and the transtheoretical model of change, these two kind of emerged around the same time, around in the 1980s. They kind of emerged in parallel. So it's not the case that one was developed in response to the other. It just so happens that at that period, there are people who were working on intervention to help strengthen people's motivation for change. And there is another group of people looking at why people don't seem to change. And then they developed that transtheoretical model of change, which tease apart that people can be at different states of change. I think we can see these two things as rather complementary to each other. In the transtheoretical model of change is a very practical theory. Even though I know that in the context of research, there are a lot of drawbacks and criticisms about this theoretical model, but then practically we do see clients at different states of readiness of change. If we see that if we are able to have this awareness and sensitivity to see the client is at which stage of change, then we can better utilize different style or different approaches of therapy. For example, if people, they are not yet at the action stage, they are in the contemplation stage, then perhaps my own approach would be a lot more MI heavy in my session with this client. Whereas if the client is not ambivalent, is not unmotivated, but is already ready for action, then perhaps I would do my session, it would be less MI heavy, but a lot more skills building, a lot more problem solving for that client. So I see a final question here. If clients are mandated or referred by others, what would you focus more on to bring them to the contemplation stage? So if the client is not even in the contemplation stage, if they are in the pre-contemplation state, but they go to see a therapist because they have to, because they are referred by other people, they are mandated perhaps by law to see a therapist, then what would I focus on? I think I might have mentioned this a little bit earlier. What I would try to do is to take a step back and understand the client's values and personal goals. If they are not so interested in talking about their problems, because they don't want to be here, they're not thinking about changing. Don't talk to me about the alcohol, or don't talk to me about, this and that, because it's not a problem. It's just the judge think it's a problem. My wife think it's a problem, but I don't think it's a problem. So don't talk to me about this. What I'll try to do is just try to take a step back, allow the space of not talking about this problem yet, but to use the time to understand the client's interests, what he likes in life, what he wanted to do, what's his interest, what is his hobbies, what are his future goals, what will he want to do, and then try to develop some discrepancy between these personal goals and values and the starting problem, the problem that he did not want to talk about. It would be a bit more likely after learning about the client as a person, then the client would be a little bit more willing to open up to talk about the problem. Because through understanding their goals, their wishes, the values, the client may have feel a better relationship with you. The therapeutic relationship, the alliance is starting to emerge. So initially, he may be very defensive and not wanting to talk about the problems, but then it may get better. He may start opening up. So this is what I would try to do for patients or clients in that pre-contemplation stage. Okay, so I think that's it for today. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. This has been rather a novel experience for me, standing in front of an empty lecture theater and doing this talk. It's been a little bit weird for me, but hopefully the connection has been okay for you. You were able to hear me well and see the PowerPoint. I hope what I shared with you today has been interesting and memorable for you. If in the future you are interested to learn more about MI, you would know what it is and what it is for. And that's perhaps, I think, is even if you don't have time, if you're not so interested to learn about MI in more details in the future, it's also interesting just to understand a little bit more about psychotherapy.